The years leading up to the War of 1812 were marked by a rising tide of frustration and uncertainty that swept across the Atlantic and washed over the young United States. The world was in upheaval. Far to the east, Europe was consumed by the Napoleonic Wars, an immense conflict between France and Great Britain that seemed endless. For the United States, a nation still forging its identity and seeking its place among global powers, these distant wars became inescapably personal. Commerce, the lifeblood of the American economy, was caught in the crossfire. Both France and Britain, determined to undermine each other's power, imposed sweeping trade restrictions. In 1806, France barred neutral nations from trading with Britain, hoping to choke off supplies to their enemy. Britain, not to be outdone, retaliated the following year by banning commerce between France, its allies, and the Americas. The high seas, once a realm of opportunity for American merchants, now bristled with peril. The Royal Navy, stretched thin by its global commitments but ever vigilant, patrolled the Atlantic, enforcing these blockades with a heavy hand. The impact on the United States was immediate and devastating. American ships, seeking profit in a world market, suddenly found themselves ensnared by foreign decrees. The British, invoking legal precedents like the Essex case of 1805, claimed broad authority to seize American vessels if they suspected them of aiding France. Over the course of a decade, more than 1,500 American ships were captured or detained, their crews left stranded, and their cargoes confiscated. The United States, still lacking a robust navy, could do little to protect its interests. But the wounds to American pride and sovereignty ran deeper than the loss of ships or trade. The British Navy, desperate for manpower, turned to impressment, seizing sailors from American vessels and forcing them into service under the Union Jack. The justification was simple in the eyes of British authorities: once a British subject, always a British subject, regardless of any new citizenship claimed across the ocean. For the thousands of Americans pressed into British service, estimates suggest as many as 10,000 during the Napoleonic Wars. This policy was a brutal reminder that the United States' independence was still contested in practice, if not in name. Impressment soon became a rallying cry in American politics, especially as each new incident underscored the nation's vulnerability. President James Madison, inheriting the crisis from his predecessors, found himself wrestling with how to defend American rights without plunging the country into open war. His predecessor, Thomas Jefferson, had tried to use economic pressure, enacting the Embargo Act of 1807, which halted all foreign trade. The hope was that by depriving Britain and France of American goods, they would be forced to respect United States neutrality. But the embargo backfired, plunging the American economy into depression while failing to sway the European powers. The non-intercourse acts that followed, targeting only Britain and France, fared little better. With every failed diplomatic gambit, public anger grew. American newspapers and politicians debated the best course, some urging patience, others demanding action. The country itself was divided. The Federalists, largely concentrated in New England, opposed the idea of war, fearing it would devastate their commercial interests. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans, led by a younger, more aggressive faction in Congress known as the War Hawks, called for a more assertive response. Their rhetoric was steeped in national honor and the promise of defending American sovereignty, but it was also entwined with ambition. The possibility of gaining new territory, particularly in British-held Canada and Spanish Florida, proved irresistible to many. Yet the Atlantic was not the only frontier where tensions simmered. To the west, the United States was in the midst of a relentless push for expansion, a process that brought it ever deeper into conflict with the native nations whose lands were coveted by American settlers. The struggle for the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region had never truly ended, and now, as the country looked to grow, it encountered fierce resistance. Many Native Americans, recognizing the existential threat posed by United States expansion, sought to unite in common defense. Among the most prominent leaders to emerge from this moment was Tecumseh, a gifted Shawnee chief, and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet. Together they spearheaded a pan-Indian movement, urging tribes to set aside old rivalries and resist the encroachment of settlers. Their vision was not merely one of defense, but of renewal, a call to reclaim traditional ways and form a powerful confederacy. The British, wary of unchecked American expansion, recognized the strategic value of this native resistance. They provided weapons and support, hoping to use the territory as a buffer against further encroachment by the United States. The alliance was mutually beneficial, but also fraught with tension and uncertainty. For the British, native allies offered a way to counterbalance American ambitions on the continent. For the native nations, the British represented perhaps the last chance to halt the destruction of their homelands. This uneasy partnership would have profound consequences once war began. Meanwhile, on the American frontier, violence was nearly constant. Settlers and native groups clashed repeatedly, each side convinced of its own right to the land. In 1811, these hostilities erupted into open conflict at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where United States forces led by William Henry Harrison attacked Prophetstown, the heart of the Pan-Indian movement. The engagement was bloody, and while American forces claimed victory, they failed to destroy the spirit of resistance. In the aftermath, suspicion and resentment deepened. Many Americans became convinced that Britain was not only supporting, but actively inciting native attacks. The line between frontier conflict and international rivalry grew ever thinner. All these tensions on the sea and the frontier, in Congress and in the press, were shaped by the larger struggle for power and recognition. The United States, only recently emerged from its own revolution, was determined to assert its sovereignty and defend its interests, both economic and territorial. The British, preoccupied by the life-and-death struggle with Napoleon, regarded American complaints as secondary, even as their policies made enemies of former colonists. To London, the war that would soon erupt across the Atlantic was a sideshow, an annoyance at the margins of empire. But to Americans, it became a test of the nation's character and a crucible for its political identity. There was no single cause of the War of 1812. Instead, it was born of a tangled web of grievances, ambitions, and misunderstandings. Britain's trade restrictions and the impressment of sailors were immediate flashpoints, fueling outrage and calls for action. The seizures of American ships, justified by British courts and reinforced by the Orders in Council, cut deeply into national pride and economic well-being. Attempts at negotiation, whether through embargoes or selective trade restrictions, only seemed to highlight the limits of American power. At the same time, the struggle for the continent's interior became increasingly tied to the fate of the war. The British alliance with Native Americans and the resistance led by Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa challenged the expansionist vision embraced by many Americans. For those living on the frontier, every clash with native groups was both a local crisis and a symbol of the broader contest between empires, nations, and peoples. The fact that native warriors would later play a key role in early British victories, such as the captures of Michilimackinac and Detroit, underscored just how interwoven their fate had become with that of the British. As 1812 dawned, President Madison found himself hemmed in by forces beyond his full control. The country was restless, its economy battered by foreign blockades and ill-fated embargoes. Political divisions ran deep, with Federalists warning of disaster and warhawks pushing for a confrontation they believed could secure both honor and new lands. The press, increasingly nationalistic, amplified every outrage and every call for retribution. In this charged atmosphere, the choice for peace or war became less a matter of policy than of identity. What did it mean to be American, and how far would the nation go to defend that ideal? When war was finally declared in June 1812, it was not simply a response to a single insult or injury. It was the culmination of years of mounting pressure on the seas, in the corridors of power, and along the ever-shifting line between settlement and wilderness. The United States entered the conflict with high hopes, convinced that its cause was just and its grievances real. Yet, as the events that followed would show, the war would test not only the nation's resolve, but also its unity, its ambitions, and its very sense of itself. Looking back, historians generally agree that the War of 1812 was, in many respects, an unintended consequence of the world's larger conflicts. The United States, striving to remain neutral and protect its commerce, instead found itself drawn into the maelstrom. Its leaders, caught between the demands of honor and the realities of power, ultimately chose confrontation over compromise. For the British, distracted by the far greater threat posed by Napoleon, the American quarrel was a secondary matter, though it would nonetheless shape relations between the two nations for decades to come. The stage was set for a conflict that would decide much more than the fate of a few ships or the boundaries of a frontier. On the eve of war, the Atlantic world was a place of shifting alliances and unfulfilled promises, where every act of aggression or defiance carried the weight of nations newly born and empires struggling to endure. The prelude to conflict had been long and bitter, its lessons as complex as the world it would soon engulf in war. As the United States declared war in the summer of 1812, few on either side could have imagined just how chaotic and unpredictable the conflict would become. The war did not unfold as a single, continuous clash, but as a series of campaigns and desperate battles scattered across hundreds of miles of forests, lakes, and rivers. Each theater brought its own cast of characters, ambitions, and moments of triumph or disaster. The stakes were never simply national pride or maritime rights. For many, especially the native peoples of the Old Northwest and Great Lakes, the war was a fight for survival. The earliest campaigns along the Canadian frontier set the tone for the conflict, messy, uncertain, and shaped as much by alliances as by armies. American leaders, eager to strike a quick blow against British Canada, launched a series of invasions that proved far more difficult than anyone in Washington had anticipated. At Detroit, the outcome was determined not only by the resolve of British regulars, but also by the formidable presence of Tecumseh and his native confederation. The psychological impact of Tecumseh's warriors, combined with clever British maneuvering, led to the humiliating surrender of an American force without a major shot being fired. This victory was more than a military win for the British. It cemented the alliance between British commanders and their native allies, fueling a string of early successes in the Old Northwest. To the east, at Queenston Heights, another American attempt to seize a foothold in Canada ended in disaster. British and Canadian militia, supported by native warriors, repelled the invaders in a bloody struggle that cost the life of British commander Isaac Brock, but preserved the line along the Niagara frontier. Throughout 1812 and into 1813, the pattern repeated. American forces, often poorly supplied and led by generals with little battlefield experience, faced determined British resistance and the constant threat of surprise attacks from native allies who knew the terrain intimately. Yet the war was not fought only on land. The Great Lakes became a vast, unpredictable battleground, with each side racing to build ships and control key waterways. The struggle for naval supremacy on Lake Erie and Lake Champlain was not just a matter of pride. Whoever controlled these lakes could move troops and supplies with relative ease, threatening enemy strongholds or defending their own. The Americans, under Oliver Hazard Perry, achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813, capturing an entire British squadron and shifting the balance of power in the region. With the lake under American control, the British and their native allies were forced to retreat from Detroit, opening the door for a renewed American advance into Upper Canada. As the armies clashed, the alliances that shaped the war began to fray. Tecumseh's Confederation, for a time the backbone of British defense in the West, faced mounting losses and dwindling resources. The turning point came at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. There, in the marshy woods of southwestern Ontario, American troops under William Henry Harrison defeated a British native force, and Tecumseh was killed in battle. His death marked the collapse of the Pan-Indian alliance that had been so crucial in the war's early years. Without his leadership, native resistance in the Old Northwest fragmented, and the British found themselves increasingly isolated. For the native peoples who had allied with the British, the consequences were profound. Tecumseh's vision of a united resistance to American expansion died with him. In the wake of defeat at the Thames and at other key sites such as Horseshoe Bend, organized native resistance began to fade. The loss of these alliances not only weakened the British position but also set the stage for a new era of American dominance in the interior, an outcome that would have lasting repercussions for generations. While the war raged in the forests and fields along the northern frontier, the Chesapeake Bay became the setting for some of the conflict's most dramatic episodes. By 1814, with Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain was able to send fresh troops and ships to North America. The British aimed to strike at the heart of the United States, targeting the symbolic and political center of Washington, District of Columbia. The campaign was as much about sending a message as about winning territory. In August, British forces landed in Maryland, brushed aside disorganized American resistance at Bladensburg, and marched into the nation's capital. What followed was a scene seared into American memory. British troops set fire to key public buildings, the Capitol, the White House, and other government offices, while a pall of smoke hung over the city. The occupation lasted just over a day. The British, having made their point, soon withdrew. Yet the burning of Washington was more than a humiliation. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the young republic, the limits of its defenses, and the high stakes of the war. Stories circulated of frantic efforts to save government documents and the personal courage of figures like Dolly Madison, who rescued important artifacts from the flames. For Americans, the loss of their capital was a shock, but also a rallying cry. Emboldened by their success, the British turned their sights to Baltimore. Unlike Washington, Baltimore was well defended and fiercely determined to resist. The city was a hub of privateering, with fast ships that had plagued British commerce, and it was known for its anti-British sentiment. In September 1814, British forces landed at North Point and moved toward the city, while their fleet prepared to bombard Fort McHenry, which guarded the harbor. Over the course of approximately 25 hours, British warships unleashed a relentless barrage on the fort, hoping to force its surrender and open the city to attack. But the defenders of Fort McHenry held firm, enduring the bombardment and returning fire whenever possible. When dawn broke, the fort's massive American flag still flew, signaling that Baltimore had not fallen. This moment of defiance inspired Francis Scott Key, who witnessed the battle from a British ship, to pen the verses that would become the Star-Spangled Banner. The defense of Baltimore was more than a tactical victory. It was a powerful boost to American morale, coming just weeks after the disaster in Washington. The British, unable to take the city by land or sea, withdrew, and the tide of the war began to turn. Elsewhere, the struggle for control played out on the waters of Lake Champlain. In September 1814, British forces attempted to invade the United States from Canada, advancing toward Plattsburgh with a large army. The fate of the campaign hinged on control of the lake. In a hard-fought naval engagement, American ships managed to defeat the British squadron, forcing the invading army to retreat. The victory at Lake Champlain not only secured the northern border, but also influenced the peace negotiations already underway in Europe. As the war entered its final months, both sides were weary, and the prospects for conclusive victory seemed distant. Yet one more dramatic act remained. In January 1815, after the peace treaty had already been signed but not yet ratified, British troops launched an assault on New Orleans. The city was guarded by American forces under Andrew Jackson, who had hastily assembled a motley collection of regulars, militia, and volunteers. The British attack was repulsed with heavy losses, in part due to strong defensive positions and the determination of Jackson's men. The news of the victory, when it reached the American public, electrified the country, even though it came after the war was officially over. For many, the Battle of New Orleans became a symbol of American resolve and a fitting, if accidental, climax to a war that had seen so many reversals of fortune. Through all these battles and turning points, the strategies of the United States and Britain shifted in response to changing fortunes and new realities. The British, initially content to defend Canada and use their native allies to harass American forces, became more aggressive once freed from obligations in Europe. Their raids along the Atlantic coast were designed to divert American resources and sap morale. The Americans, meanwhile, learned hard lessons from early failures, gradually improving their leadership and coordination, especially in the later stages of the war. Yet the war's outcome was shaped as much by what happened off the battlefield as on it. The collapse of native alliances after Tecumseh's death and the defeat of the Red Sticks at Horseshoe Bend meant that, by the war's end, organized native resistance to American expansion had been broken. The balance of power in the Old Northwest shifted decisively in favor of the United States. In the aftermath, the United States government moved swiftly to assert control over lands once fiercely contested, a process that would lead to new policies of removal and assimilation for indigenous peoples. For those who had fought, survived, or lost loved ones, the War of 1812 left a legacy of both pride and sorrow. The major battles, the burning of Washington, the defense of Baltimore, the fights on the Great Lakes and the Canadian frontier became touchstones in national memory. Each side could claim moments of glory and moments of pain. The British had defended Canada but failed to deliver a decisive blow. The Americans had survived invasion and humiliation, but at a terrible cost to native nations. As the smoke cleared and peace returned, the United States found itself changed. The war had not produced clear victors or dramatic territorial gains, but it had forged a sense of unity and resilience. The major turning points: the collapse of the Native Confederacy, the stand at Fort McHenry, the retreat of British forces from Baltimore and Lake Champlain, and the unexpected triumph at New Orleans became woven into the story Americans would tell about themselves in the years ahead. The era of good feelings that followed drew much of its strength from the sacrifices and surprises of these campaigns, and from the sense that, even in the face of disaster, the nation could endure. In the end, the War of 1812 was not a simple struggle between two nations, but a tangled conflict shaped by alliances, betrayals, and the ambitions of peoples large and small. Its battles and turning points echoed far beyond the fields and cities where they were fought, reshaping the destinies of Americans, Britons, and indigenous peoples alike. The war's legacy would be measured not only in treaties and boundaries, but in the stories of courage and loss that lingered long after the guns fell silent. While the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814, in Belgium and called for an end to hostilities, fighting did not immediately cease. Due to slow communication across the Atlantic, significant battles, including the most famous, Andrew Jackson's defense of New Orleans, continued into January 1815 before news of the treaty reached American forces. When the guns finally fell silent in early 1815, the world that emerged looked, on the surface, remarkably similar to the one that had existed before the War of 1812 began. The Treaty of Ghent did not redraw boundaries or declare victors. Instead, it called for a restoration of the status quo ante bellum. Each side was to return to its pre-war lands and possessions, as if the preceding years of bloodshed and uncertainty had been little more than a tempest in a teapot. Yet beneath this veneer of apparent stasis, the war's aftermath quietly set in motion forces that would reshape the United States, its politics, its sense of self, and its place in the world.